Welcome to video 8. We are going to actually build out our portfolio based on the mockup we created in video 7. So just as a point of reference, here's the mockup we created in video 7. You're more than welcome to try to create your own, but if you're just sort of beginning and learning about layouts and HTML and CSS, I would advise you just kind of follow along. If you're more advanced, feel free to create your own mockup in Figma and try to create that in HTML and CSS on your own. But let's take a look at the grid here. Let's turn it back on. And again, just as a quick reminder, we've got 12 column grid. Each of these pink rectangles here that span the height of this mockup constitutes one column in the grid. So that's an important sort of concept to understand. So, if we want to make an item, 50% width or half the width of the layout, we're going to want to make it span 6 columns because that's obviously half of 12, right? So there's a little bit of math that goes on in terms of the grid layout here. Another concept I want to quickly sort of reinforce is we're going to be using the bootstrap framework, and in the bootstrap framework and pretty much any sort of CSS framework, you need to think about the different components of your website as in rows and columns, right? So, for example, this hero section would constitute a row that spans 12 columns, right? Or these two portfolio pieces would constitute a row that each spans 6 columns each. And then this is another row with, again, the same layout, the items spanning 6 columns each. Just an important sort of thing to understand in terms of how we lay things out in HTML and CSS. Right? So anytime there's a new piece of content, you can kind of think of it as a row. So here's a row, our hero section, here's a row, our first set of portfolio pieces, here's a row, a second set of portfolio pieces, and here's a row, our footer. Okay, so in our layout, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 rows, if not more. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up our index.html, and this is the index, the main landing page where we left off in video 6. And what I'm going to do is I am going to give you a quick little intro to Bootstrap, but really the main thing we'll use in Bootstrap is their grid system. So you can read about that on your own, but there's a documentation page for the grid system that kind of shows you how it works. So let me just quickly walk you through. So for example, this is a 3-column layout, 3 even columns. You've got a row, a div with a class of a row, which is a Bootstrap class that's already created in the framework. And inside the row, you've got 3 columns. Let's see. I think that's good for now. I don't want to get overly confusing at this point. But I will link this page, the Get Started page, to show you how to implement Bootstrap into your website. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab these required meta tags and this Bootstrap CSS. Okay. This all goes in inside of our head tag. So I'm going to, inside of our head tag, copy and paste the required meta tags and the link to the Bootstrap CSS. Okay, so the Bootstrap CSS you can actually pull it up at this URL and look at it if you'd like. It's a lot of CSS code. But in this CSS code are all these classes that already exist so that we don't have to create those classes ourselves in our CSS. So we're just kind of borrowing from Bootstrap in that case. And then if we want to include the optional JavaScript as well, that will give us access to other components. It will give us access to some animations and things like that. So I'm going to copy these 3 scripts, so jQuery, popper.js, and the bootstrap.js file. And I'm going to paste that all the way at the bottom before the body closes. So I'm going to go and paste the JavaScript, the links to the JavaScript sources at the bottom of the page. So any page we want to use Bootstrap, we would have to add these links to the head and to the bottom of the page. Okay, so that gives us, if I save this, that gives us access to Bootstrap. Now, these fonts, the default fonts will change now, and that will kind of tell us that Bootstrap is working. So if I refresh, you can see the default font. I can't remember exactly what the default font is, but it's not, you know, Times New Roman or whatever it was before. So we know that Bootstrap is currently working. So let's go ahead and kind of work through this. So I think what we'll do is we're going to ignore this section for now, and we will start with the second section, the hero section here. And really, I don't think there's anything we need to do with the hero section because it's not really a multi-column layout, right? So the only time we're going to really use the row and the column idea is if we've got a multi-column layout. So I may have misspoke earlier when I said we're going to have, you know, rows and columns for every single part of every single component on this website. For this hero section, we actually probably don't need to do anything because it's just one column. So let's ignore this section and ignore this section, and let's focus on these 4 portfolio pieces. So let's go and find that, and we've got this div called main content, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some of the other content that we had here too. So we had the tools used section as well. So I'm going to add in H3 heading 3 the tools used to each of these 4 projects that we have. Okay, so if we refresh, now we've got the tools used. We got to resize some of the fonts and things like that, but we at least are matching the content here. Okay, so now we want to lay these out into 2 columns, and we want each of those columns to span 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns wide. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put inside of main content, I'm going to add a div and put a class of row on it. Okay, so we're going to count this as our row, these first 2 portfolio pieces. So I'm going to locate these first 2 portfolio pieces, and I'm going to indent just to keep everything clean. And I'm going to close my row after the first 2 portfolio pieces. So the row closes here. And so we see we've got project 1, project 2, and I accidentally closed it after project 3. So I'm going to move this. I'm going to close this after project 2. Okay, so we've got a row there, and I'm going to add another row. So again, here's one row with 2 columns, and here's another row with 2 columns. So I'm going to add another row and wrap the remaining projects in this div. Okay, so I'm going to comment and say row 2. And so now we can see we've got one row that opens here with 2 projects inside of it, or 2 portfolio pieces. We've got a second row with 2 projects or 2 portfolio pieces inside of it. So we're matching our layout here. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to refresh, and nothing should happen. And that is right, nothing happens, which is totally fine. And here's what we're going to do. We are now going to introduce columns, right? So we have a div with a class of row, which signifies where we want this to be a row. Now we want to wrap each of these projects in a div that signifies a column, okay? So inside of this row, I'm going to create a div with the class of column 6, because we want it to span 6 columns wide. Okay, so as you can imagine, this can be column 1 through 12. If you put 8, it would span 8. If you put 4, it would span 4. In this case, we want it to span 6. Okay, so I'm going to close my column 6 right after our project here, and I'm going to make a comment and say this is where column 6 closes. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing. We want to create another column that spans 6. And as you can imagine, you can do any combination that adds up to 12 or is less than 12. And it will break it into columns. So I did that on the second, it looks like I did that on the second set of portfolio pieces. So I'm gonna just copy and paste this column 6 div and do it on the first set of portfolio pieces as well. So just the exact same thing, column 6. And we're going to, again, wrap this project in a div called column 6. Okay, so again, those concepts that we learned in the beginning videos are really important now, right? We've got lots of different divs that are nested inside of other divs. So we've got a row with 2 columns nested inside of them. In each column, we've got a div called project as well. Okay, so if I save this and I refresh, we're going to have a 2-column layout starting here. So we've got 1 column, 2 columns. Cool, right? So that's looking pretty good, actually. And what I'm going to do is I am going to, so the reason why these are sort of overlapping is because we've got no CSS to control the images in these columns. So some of these images are wider than the actual, like the native width of the pixels in the resolution is wider than our screen here. And so it's spilling over into the next div. So what we're going to do is we are going to open our style.css. I'm going to open it in the same instance of Sublime. And I'm going to create a section called portfolio pieces on the homepage. Just try to be as descriptive as possible. And I'm going to target this image, okay? So to target this image or select this image in CSS, we don't want to just select image because that would change every image on the entire website. We want to select project first and then image. So what I'll do is I'll select project by doing the class selector for project and then the image tag. So basically we're saying all images inside of div class project, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a width on the image, and we can use percentages, right? So I'm going to do 100%, and it's 100% of its containing div, okay? So it's 100% of our col6 div. So let's refresh, and now we'll see our gutters and our margin is working, right? So just like we have a little bit of margin, and it's bigger than 16 pixels, I believe. But we have a little bit of margin between each of these elements. We have that margin sort of in a grid sort of happening here, okay? So let's, another thing you might notice is the native height of these images are different, and that makes this look really sloppy, right? So in our mock-up, they're all the same height and they're kind of square-like here. And right now we've got a rectangle here and we've got a square, you know, more of a square in this picture. And so these are different heights. So what we can do is we can declare a height and then make them all exactly the same. So let's try 400 pixels. We could look at this. Right now it's 615 pixels. I think that's probably too big. Yeah, maybe we'll try 500. Okay, that looks more, more square-like. And you'll notice though, is the image fits into the height, but if it's not the sort of the native resolution, it gets skewed. It gets the aspect ratio gets messed up. So you can easily see if I made this 800, for example, or I'm sorry, let's make it smaller. If I made this 200, for example, you see how these things get squished. And that's just because the native way that HTML renders images. So to fix that, we can use a CSS variable called object fit. So we want to fit this object, this image, and there's a couple different options we can do. We can do contain, which will take the width. It will take into account the width, and it will render the entire image. So that's not going to fix our problem, right? So it sort of zooms out if it's a taller image. So we still have the same width and height, but it's not filling the entire div with the image in the way that this is filling the entire div with the image. So instead of contain, we're going to do object fit cover. And this is actually a really helpful bit of CSS here. It's going to crop the image and zoom it in to fill the entire div. So if we refresh and we see, it's going to crop the image, and now they're all the same width and the same height, and they're not squished, or the aspect ratio isn't messed up in any way. So that's a really helpful way to think about this. Okay, so let's. So we have this. We probably need a little bit more space between these sections. So let's let's go ahead and do that in our CSS. So one, we can add some margin at the bottom of our hero section, and that will create some space between the hero section and our portfolio pieces. So let's do that. So margin dash bottom, and we'll go, I like to go in increments of 16 pixels. So we'll go 16 and see how that looks. And it looks like the default gutter here between columns is 32 pixels. So if we want to make it maybe a little bit more even, I put a margin bottom of 32 pixels. Okay, so now we've got a little bit more space. I thought that I thought there was an automatic margin bottom of 32 pixels on a row, but apparently there isn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that. So I'm going to just target the row, and I'll do margin bottom 32 pixels. And we'll put a little bit more space on the row here. Okay, so with just a couple classes, we're able to sort of recreate our layout here. I think our font sizing is a little bit off, so let's fix that. We wanted our project title to be 24 pixels, so let's target that H2. And to target that H2, we can use that class we created called project again. So project, and then we can target H2, and we can change the font size to 24 pixels. Another cool thing you can actually do is you can export CSS, I believe, in yeah, if you click the Inspect tab, you can export CSS. I wouldn't recommend this necessarily, but it can help if you have a lot of detail in your mockups. But font size 24, and then we're going to target H3, which is our tools used section. And is it the same size? 24 pixels. So actually what we can do is, instead of creating a whole new style, you can put multiple styles if they have the same CSS properties, and separate them by a comma. So project H2 and project H3, they're both 24 pixels in this case. So let's refresh, and now we can see we've shrunk it down a little bit. I actually think it's probably too big still. I tend toward maybe smaller type on a website, so I'm going to actually change this to 20 pixels and see how that looks. Yeah, I think that looks a little better. All right. So we've got our grid, which is super great. What else can we do in this? Let's go ahead and, oh, I wanted to show you one other thing here. Right now we've used col6, which puts these in divs that span 6 columns on the grid. However, if we resize, these are going to stay in col6, and it doesn't look terrible, but it looks a little bit stretched. And so if we're thinking about mobile design, right, and responsive design that changes depending on what device we're on, we want to think about what we would want to do with these columns if we had a smaller viewport. And so Bootstrap's grid is really helpful in that it automatically has responsive styles built in some of their classes. So what we can do is, instead of call-6, we can do call-md-6. And that MD stands for a breakpoint. It stands for a specific breakpoint, medium breakpoint. So in the Bootstrap grid, when the viewport gets to 768 pixels or smaller, it's going to do something different, right? So call MD6 basically just says in viewports that are 768 pixels or larger, span 6. In viewports that are 768 pixels or smaller, don't do anything. And so if we add this, the easiest way to show you this is by illustration. So I'm going to add the call MD6 to all of these call 6s. And in 768 pixels and wider, nothing should happen. But when we shrink it down to 768 pixels or smaller, it goes into back into one column. Okay, so that's a typical sort of responsive layout, is to make your multiple column layouts into one column on mobile. We can also use different breakpoints, right? So if we change this to call LG6, this, I think I don't know exactly what the pixels are. I think it's 1024 pixels or larger, it will stay in 2 columns. 1024 pixels and smaller, it will break into 1 column. So we can see how that broke much earlier into 1 column. Or we can change this to call SM6. And I believe the SM breakpoint is 480 pixels. So if we refresh again, 480 pixels or larger, it's going to stay 2 columns. 480 pixels or smaller, which is right there, it's going to break into 1 column. Okay, so you can imagine this is really handy if we've got if we're using the Bootstrap the Bootstrap grid consistently throughout our website. 90% of it is going to be automatically responsive if we use these breakpoints in our columns. So I'm just going to keep it at call SM6 for now, and that will give us a chance to automatically have this responsive. I think we'll end it there. If you want to on your own, you can go ahead and try to do a couple things. You can try to add more portfolio pieces and practice with different layouts. You can do all kinds of things. So for example, let me do this one thing really quickly. So if I made this call SM4 instead of 6, these each are going to span 4 columns. Okay, so let's say you had 5 portfolio pieces, not an even 4. You'd have a space for a 3-column layout followed by a 2-column layout, right? So there's different ways we can do this. So let me just, for illustration purposes, copy this entire call SM4 and show you what a 3-column layout would look like. Right? So, and if we wanted a 4-column layout, you could change this to call SM3, right? Because 12 divided by 3 is 4 columns. So if I copied and pasted this whole div again, we would switch to a 4-column layout, right? So our mock-up showed 2-column layout, so we're going to use call 6. So I'm just going to undo all of that, but I just wanted to show you for illustration purposes. But if you want to experiment with different types of layouts, if you want to maybe even experiment with our footer, if you want to do something with the footer and try to play around with Bootstrap's grid in the footer, that would be a good thing too. But in the next video, we'll clean up the header, we'll clean up the footer, and we'll move on to maybe some more advanced CSS. So until next time.